you guys a link and the time in the chat. Please make sure that if you're interested, please join them. There are some ideas that has come up, and we wanted to build on that idea, and we are looking for developers, testopers, and everyone to join and help with those hackathon projects. With that, Sumit, I will hand over the session to you.
Yeah. I'll wait for 1 more minute and then I'll start.
All right, so that means I have 1 more minute. Um, those who are interested and wanted to learn microservices and Kubernetes, it's going to start on August 15th. The entry is in Eventbrite. You can actually register. There's a beautiful trainer. He's been regarded by many industry experts, and his name is Ahmad Harb. He agreed to provide us training on the introduction to Kubernetes and microservices. Very important topic for everyone to know and learn, because as you all know, moving forward, the architecture is going to be based on microservices and Kubernetes in most of the cases, right? I'm not saying all the cases, but most of the cases. It's a good topic to really understand and learn whatever that you are doing, irrespective of whether you are in a testing domain or in an operations domain, or even in the development domain. This is very critical to understand. I would appreciate if you are interested to go to Eventbrite and register it. The event is available in the Eventbrite.
White આમાં નહીં હોય બેટા તે દાડી બાર રખડતા હતા મારા white. How come it goes there?
Okay, sorry about that. I just muted Hetal. All right. So if you are interested, please, the event is published in the Eventbrite. Register it and benefit from it. What else? What else? Yeah, I think your 1 minute is over. Sumit, you want to take over?
Sure. Just give me 1 moment. I'm just uploading some exercise files.
Mickey, make sure that you mentioned the hackathon meeting and the link posted in the chat. And also, please ensure that, yeah, okay, perfect. Ensure that the team is, if they are interested, have them to kind of, engage us in the hackathon channel, introduce their name and share with us that they are interested to build something, right? Rather than just learning, right? Yeah, more or less.
So before we start, does anyone have any questions on our previous sessions? Cool. So everyone was able to run the Tavern test and no issues on that one? Okay, awesome. So let me share the link to Trat Git repo, which I just uploaded a couple of files there for today's session. Awesome. So let me share my screen now. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. So I've created another. Today we will discuss about framework, right? So some of the components we already discussed in our last session in terms of what is required in terms of creating a uniform flow and reusable flow. Today we'll talk about a couple of things. First, the structure of the framework on how can we structure the framework in such a way that everyone should be able to work on it, and then how to structure it also in a way that it becomes much more easier to execute uh, the tests that are included in your project. Logging mechanism, how we did talk about a custom logger before, but more on the reporting side rather on the logging side, right? When you basically want to integrate it with any CI/CD pipeline or want to send the results directly to some other team, how we can make that reporting easier. And then we'll talk about some of the configuration that we need to set up uh, so that we know that our framework is uh, good enough for any portability and reusability standards, right? So I've uploaded this exercise in GitHub. I would recommend everyone to download that before we proceed. If not, I will definitely, if some of you're not able to download anything from there, then I'll probably copy paste some of the content in the chat window itself, right? Now, a couple of things to note here is first, today we are going to use this TV Maze API. This is an open API uh, where, so I'll send this link to the teams as well. So what this API allow us to do is basically it has you can search any TV shows that are existing in the market, and then we can uh, query using show names and stuff like that. So if I just query search shows, searching for some show called Girls, and then if I go to JSON Viewer, I copy paste this to see what the response is. Uh, so it gives me a lot of details on what that show is, right? And then what's the official site? It's an HBO.com series. What kind of genre this is, what kind of rating this has, and what kind of schedule, running time it has, and when it presents itself. On TV, it's on Sunday at 22. And then what network, name, country which it belongs to, and then external IMDb ratings and IMDb links, and then images on some of. So this gives me everything about that show, right? If I go here, Good Girls, right? So any show that is related to that contains the word girls, it will show me those shows, right? And all that show. I can view Dairy Girls and running time. So it basically gives me whole TV landscape where I can actually look into a particular show and get the details of the show. Now, why do we need some of these APIs, right? The big question is why someone actually created this API? What was the need? What was the motivation that he wanted to pick these things and create as an API, right? Because this is not an official, let's say, HBO API, right? Uh, eh, where it's only displaying HBO show. What's the point of having this kind of data uh, present to people, right? Now, the idea behind any API development is basically to create your own apps, right? Mash some of the apps together, right? Create a chain links between some of the other APIs and get the information that you really need. So, for example, this did show me that it runs on HBO. Now, it doesn't give me the details on the cast of that particular show or basically the 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 producer, the director of that particular show, right? And what kind of advertisement it is doing. So all the data might come from different services, right? Some advertising agency or some marketing agency might be running some APIs that will give that kind of information, right? HBO might be running uh, uh, another API which will give the information on the cast and their producer directors, right, or the music involved. So what this API allows us to do is that once we have this info, we are looking for some info. We are not going to get all the info at one place, right? It this guy is still doing some kind of aggregation to fetch this kind of data, but then he's creating a single API where we can view all the aggregated data, right? Now, when let's say I am developing my own app and I want to display on a UI that these are the top 10 shows that are running right now, right? So that kind of information I want to provide to my customers, right? Now, this API won't allow the users to actually do that, right? That user has to create a script or a get or a post request and get all the info, then aggregate the info, and then look for the top average with basically not just on this side, but on, let's say, IMDb side as well, and look at the top rating shows and then get that info. And that info is going to get in a JSON format, right? Now, what he's going to do is he cannot represent that data to someone in this JSON format, right? It's pretty much non-readable until unless I actually go into this tool, a web tool where I am actually putting in the JSON and getting this kind of view. But the actual view that I'm getting is this, right? This is very chunky data that I'm not able to view in the JSON format, right? As a user, I'm not able to view. I have to use an external tool, right? Even that will not give me flexibility to know that what the ask is on the user or the app, right? I just want to display the top 10 running shows at the current time and not just any time, right? So these shows might not be running right now, right? There's just showing that it premiered on 2012, right? It might not be running at this point of time. So I just want to know that any show that has the biggest rating and is running right now, right? So I have to put some logic in this JSON to fetch that data, right? And what I will do with that data is I'll mash that data with some other APIs or some other open source services, and then I can create my own app and I can present that data, right? Now let's talk about the testing terms on this, right? Uh, what I mean to say is that what do we test in this API, right? Uh, we can test a lot of the things in terms of uh, this. So at an overview level, when we are testing this API, we just want to make sure that the data that it is returning is correct, right? Now, if put in an ID of 139, which is on the top, and say that I want to check what data is returned when I give an ID of 139 and what kind and the data that I receive should be the expected data that I really want to look at right now. That becomes a way of validating it through either a JSON response that you already have. You might have all the response, all the JSON parameters as a response to test against, or specific type of tests so that you actually know that you don't need to run this against the whole ID data set, right? There might be millions of IDs that you need to test, and you just want to navigate and see if the name that is being presented is correct. Now, a good way of doing that at an overview or a sample size level is you hard code those values or get when you're doing a manual testing of API, you store those responses in a JSON format in your files. And then when you create the test, you validate against those manual tests, right? The idea is that your this is an open API and this particular path will remain pretty much the same for a long time. But then when you're in the development phase, right, uh, the path can have different settings and it can keep on changing, right? So the best way is to check those at that level. And then some of the things that you need to test are not the exact data values, but let's say the format of what kind of data is being returned. or a threshold value where you say that this value should lie between 6 or 7. The average should lie between 6 and 7. So you can do those kind of validations, right? All right, so let's move on to the actual test. So, w- so I'm going to talk about the reporting first, right? So we we looked at some logs in our previous session, which will look like this. This is mostly from the debug perspective, right? Let me increase my font again, right? So let's say we are having our logs based on this. This basically gives me uh, a debug view of what is happening when I'm running the test, right? Now, when I'm running the test, I'm getting these responses. So somewhere, if my test is failing, I can directly copy this line, put it in the JSON viewer, and then look at what exactly is going wrong, right? So for me, the debugging becomes really easy when I do these kind of things, right? So when I do log everything that I am doing, it's much more easier for me to debug because I exactly know at what function my test is failing and what kind of data it's failing on, right? So when I can just get this response, put it in the JSON viewer, and look at the test to see what exactly is failing, right? So my debugging becomes really easy in that firm. But then I cannot send this to any management or uh, or, or someone who needs to actually view at the results and see or try to make sense of what exactly is failing, right? So in that ways, what we do is we add a couple of libraries in there. The first one is PyTest JSON. So whenever we do any execution, it will report the results in the JSON format. So the JSON will look like this. Uh, so if I open this JSON file, I'll copy this and I will go to online JSON viewer again. This and this is the JSON report that I've received, right? Now, this JSON report is why we created a JSON report is because a lot of tools nowadays are using JSON format in order to get a dashboard up and running to view the results. For example, uh, when you talk about Grafana or a tool which consumes JSON to display the dashboard like ELK, right? Elastic Grafana are a couple of examples that really use JSON in that way. And so you can maintain a history or create a live view on what your tests are doing and at what state your tests are, right? So it gives a management view or a dashboard to everyone with details on what exactly is running and what exactly is failing, right? So if I look at uh, open this report, the part is that this JSON file needs to be consumed by some tool. Otherwise, there's no point sending this JSON file to any management person because then they won't be able to actually decipher what this JSON really means, and it won't aggregate your test results uh, in a way that any external tool that are currently being used by DevOps team or your dev team can do, right? So we ran 3 tests. We ran 4 tests and then 2 passed, 2 failed. A number of tests that we run were 3, but there were multiple iteration in a single test. So that's what it is showing. And then the name of the test that is being run. Uh, and then basically your duration of the test, and then the call on what the actual step was doing. And then if I look at some of the failures, the call will include STD error as well, right? So this will be consumed by, as I said, an external tool, any data aggregator tool that your company is using, right? Elastic is one example, Grafana is one, and then you have a log. Uh, logs.io, which aggregate the logs. And then you can put an insights on top of it, right? You can put a machine learning algorithm or any kind of uh, logic that basically will determine in the longer run that if this is the failure, this is the issue that the application is having, right? So so what people are nowadays doing is they're aggregating the logs. So an example is this, that the key mismatch is there and the value expected is uh, this, and what you're getting is something different, right? So your name is looking, but you are looking for the name girls. So the value that you are validating against is mismatching. So in that ways, if I look at this, I exactly, if this happens, let's say multiple times with different data sets, my my dashboard should be able to say, if I put proper algorithms inside the dashboard. Some of the dashboards are already coming in built with those insights nowadays. Uh, Logs.io is one that comes with built insights. It will tell you exactly what should you be doing in order to resolve these issues, right? Not from the testing perspective only, but from the development and the operations perspective as well. So once I get this error, then I can create a Jira ticket on top of it, and then uh, the the log aggregator will pick up that Jira log as well, and it will look at what action was taken on top of it, right? So that's a very good use case if uh, you guys want to implement something like that in your organization, right? It will give you a basic insights into, uh, and it will create some visibility into when a test fails, what is the impact on the overall development or operational effort to see exactly how you can resolve those issues. Any questions till now on this? Okay. So the next report that we will be generating is on the XML side. So this XML result that we will generate will be on the same lines, but then this XML is basically for the consumption of any CI/CD pipelines, right? Any CI/CD pipeline like your Jenkins, your Bamboo, your Travis CI, all consume either JSON or XML in order to view results, right? So this basically the generation of XML is for the consumption of your CI/CD tools and not for the data aggregator tools, right? Not the log aggregator tool. And then you have a user view where you have an HTML format. For this, the file is PyTest HTML, which we will be using so that you get a HTML format report where you can just go in there, open in a browser. So if I open this report in a browser, it will tell me two passed, two failed in an HTML format. And then you can select, deselect, and just look at passed or just look at failed. And then you can collapse the results. Uh, Look at the details, look at the duration, look at the test name, and then when you show the details, it will highlight the errors in red, and it will show you the response as well that you are, the request that you are sending and the response that you are getting in a very readable fashion, right? It's more so, and it's on the individual test level as well, right? So you exactly know the name is girls, the actual name that turned up was looking. So this is the error that we have received. It will highlight that in red. If I go to other test, it will show me the same. The name is getting on that we have received, but the name that we needed was girls, right? So it becomes a really readable format. And then uh, this HTML file you can keep on aggregating. So it will then it will keep on adding on top of it as an append. And then it will tell you the report that is getting generated, or you can use this report as well uh, to to create a dashboard. But it's a little tricky from the HTML perspective to create dashboard on this. But then ideally, JSON format is much more easier in order uh, to create a dashboard and a live one as well, where you get the live feed on what your tests are doing, right? And then any logs that you want to display here, you can add those logs here, and it will show exactly the information details that you uh, really want to capture in the past as well, right? I generally don't capture anything in the past. It becomes it makes the readability a little trickier, and then it does give me the parameterized test. This I will talk about it later on. What 140 and 141 means. It's for general identification that I will guide on the next topic, right? So these are the reports that gets generated. So JSON is for the log aggregator tools. XML file results that gets generated is for the CI/CD tools, and the HTML report that gets generated is at the general user level, right? So from the framework perspective, reporting is the most important part, where you basically want to show uh, or send the results to everyone so that they have a view on what your tests are actually doing, right? And for yourself as well, right? So you can have a historical report data with you so that you exactly know what is failing, when it failed from the audit perspective as well, from the governance perspective as well. So this is an important part. And how to enable those things are add a couple of libraries that we need, the JSON library and the HTML library. And then you have to add uh, uh, the XML, which is your JUnit reader. And this comes baked in PyTest, so you don't need a library for that. And this is for general. So this is a by default report generation on PyTest, and then you tell the path where you want those files to be stored. So you add that as a command in talks, and that's about it, right? So that's how you generate report. So you don't have to create a lot of custom code for reporting. Uh, Most of the things comes baked in. Some of the configuration you definitely need to change in the commands. Any questions? Okay. Awesome. So let's move on to the next topic. So let's talk about the test and some of the framework components that we really want to use, right? So, uh, so as I said, I'm using the API for TV Maze. This is the path URL that I'm sending. Now, an important part of it is, let's start from the top, right? Marks. So what marks is basically doing is it's giving a marker to a test, right? So let's assume my project has 100 files, or you want to segregate your work files different from your colleagues, right? Three people are working on a project. They all want to create their own YAMLs and not mess with each other YAMLs, right? They want to create their own test. Now, how when the execution happens, how do we make sure that we are making sure that all the tests that have been created in multiple files are being executed? Do you go to the talks and keep adding those files, right? That becomes a little, not a little, but a lot more bulkier in terms of maintenance of the or the development process, right? It becomes really, really challenging because anyone can keep their own names or create their own naming structure or the file naming convention based on what they feel like, right? You don't want to get too much into details of having to standardize everything, right? uh, that becomes a little more trickier also in the terms that then it then then your development process becomes a little slower, right? So what marks does is basically you put that marker in any file or any test, right? So let's assume I created this test. So I'd give a marker as TV maze and all, right? Now the second test that I create, I said test name is TV maze post and all, right? And the third test, again, TV maze and all. So when I go to my talks file, when I've created an environment, I don't need to provide the file name. All I'm gonna do is uh, tell tell the talks that run all the tests with a marker all, right? And I can define multiple markers here as well, right? But here is the point, right? You create whatever structure you want, whatever folders you want to create, whatever, however you are comfortable with creating your project structure, right? In terms of functionality you can create, right? Or services you can create. So based on that, right? So there are a couple of ways to structure your project, but you can customize that structure based on what you feel comfortable with, but it won't change the functionality of your execution, right? Or you don't have to do a lot of maintenance in terms of how your execution is being done. So in terms of that, if I run all marker, then all the tests that are there, because I have put all in every test as a marker, so it will run all the three tests, right? Uh, but if I put the marker just as TV maze, it will run just two tests, right? If I put the marker as TV maze post request, right, or post, it will run only one test. And then I can have other team members create multiple tests in their own files, but you standardize your project based on the marker, so you exactly know what marker your test is being created for, right? So you can structure your project based on the markers. Any questions? Let me see.
Sumit, I
Yeah,
have a question. So, like currently, the test YAML files, multiple YAML files we can create, right? At that
correct.
time, like, is there any way can we do the parallel execution as well?
Right. So good question. So if you go to talks, right? So you see the marker here as leave the marker. Look at the n number as one, right? So basically, this is a
Yes.
thread number. So what it
Okay.
tells me right now is, so we use this library, which is called PyTest XDist library, which is a distribution of your test library, right? So if I give the number here as 5, it will run 5 parallel tests. If I give the number as 1, it will run one test at a time.
Okay. Cool.
So
Thank you.
your parallel execution is being defined in the PyTest itself, right? So you don't have to create a lot of code in order to run, or a boilerplate in order to run those parallelization concepts, right? So it's baked in into this library, and then it's a library for PyTest. So we are using that as as baked in functionality, right? Very easy to implement. Just put the n to whatever number your system can handle. Generally, uh, if you have low RAM, you try to give a lower number of parallel execution, because it will then might run out of memory. So you need to consider, from infrastructure point of view, you need to consider that, right? Otherwise, there is no limitation on what number of threads or parallel execution you want to execute. So I will run, let's run parallelization as 2. When we execute next, I will show you how the two are running in parallel. All right, where was I? All right, and then a very good functionality that Tavern provides is includes, where you can include some of the files in the YAML itself. So we did a common.yaml in our previous lecture, where we provided that parameter here in the Tavern global config. but there will be cases in the framework where the best practice is to include the folder specific or the package specific files inside the YAML file itself, right? So the common.yaml is common for the test folder, right? Uh, but all the YAML files that so let's see what's common.yaml has, right? So it has URL, path, and command, and I can have multiple environments based on this, right? And what global config has is prod environment variables and dev environment variables, which are basically common across the tests, right? And not just for this test. So you can have a specific file based on, let's say, you have a dev environment and a prod environment where you have different paths. So what you can do is you can add those paths in the common.yaml and create one for common dev.yaml and one common prod.yaml, and then you can use those. So what it does is, if I go to common.yaml, what it does is it keeps your uh, so if anyone changes the path or the URLs on, let's say, the next deployment of your API, you exactly know there is only one place where you need to make change, and you don't need to go here and do a hard coding of any kind of URL, right? I'm doing it currently, but don't do any kind of hard coding, right? That's the idea behind. So if I just copy this, put it in common.yaml. So I have environment and URL. So I can use this as so this is how I should be writing my test, right? I don't want to hard code anything in my test. The idea is to put all the parameters, all the URLs, all the things that you really need, even the status codes, right? What I need to do is I need to change this to, let's say, if I, so instead of writing this here, I can do this. So this makes my readability of the test much more simpler, and my test code a lot maintainable. So for example, if I have multiple tests and have the same environment URL in multiple tests and multiple files, I have to go to each and every place and actually make that change, right? What it will not allow me to do is to make those changes easily. Let's say I'm using a URL that other people are also using, right, in their own test. And somehow that URL changes. I have to go, let's say, assume some of the people left your organization. Then I go through your every page and look for where that URL is and what impact will it make if I change that. But if I have a config URL, then I exactly know, let's change the URL there. I know all the tests will run successfully as they're running now.
Oh, one question, Sumit.
Sure.
So you said we can execute multiple tests in a same YAML file, right?
Yes.
So is there any specific format we have to follow? Because I tried this.
Yes. So we
I
do have
couldn't
this.
succeed. I did
Right.
not get it.
So the first thing that you need to do a format is, this is the starting point of the test. So if you're
You mean
creating,
the three
yes, three
dashes? Okay.
dashes, three dashes. So this is the starting point of the, if you're creating multiple tests, you
Uh-huh.
need to start your test with three dashes. So,
Okay.
so let's assume this is my one, not assume it's the first test. It's first test. So it ends here. Now the YAML will pick up my next test start at this point.
Okay, because I tried this one and I tried creating another YAML file in the
Right.
same folder. Both didn't succeed to me. So I understood the reason for why the other YAML file, the second YAML file, did not execute, because you were mentioning that the PyTest command
Correct.
hyphen n thing, right? So I didn't know that it is there. It's always executing the same tavern file and it's not
Right. Right.
executing the other one.
Because if you look at the previous example, it doesn't
Mhm.
mention any marker. I didn't talk about the marker in the last session. It was only
Yeah,
the file name. So every
yeah,
time you will try to execute, it will execute the same file if you don't change the file name.
yeah. And the other thing which so I created another YAML file in addition to the simple tavern one.
Mhm.
I don't know why. I think it didn't execute both the files. It just threw the error to me, saying I don't remember exactly, but even the first one didn't execute. That's what I found. I don't know why.
Did you specify both the file names in the
No, I didn't specify both the file names. I didn't know that I have to specify something like that.
right?
So I just created another one and placed it in the test folder.
Mhm,
And I tried to execute the talks hyphen e tavern command.
mhm, mhm.
But it threw the error to me. It didn't execute the successful file also, which first time when
Right.
I ran
Yeah.
it.
So might be the reason might be that it was trying to compile the second YAML file and somehow the format was not correct, or there
Okay,
was some issue with the second file, right? Uh,
yeah,
so try using the marker. So that will make
okay,
it much more simpler for you to not. That's why. That's why the marker is there, because you will get confused between the file names, right? And the marker is
yeah.
there to actually avoid those scenarios.
Okay, I didn't know that we can do it like this. I just copy pasted in
Right. Right.
underneath the first test. The second one I copy pasted there, but it didn't succeed.
Right. So let,
I
let me
didn't
know
know
the
that it's not
let
there.
me know the error and I can take a look at it. Without
Okay,
knowing the error, I am not
yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. Thank you.
All right. So as I said, the includes is also one of the same ways, much more maintainable, where you are defining just based on these tests or these module in a test, right? So I'm giving this test name as test, but I can have a new Python package saying test TV service, right? So something like that, right? So I create a new package, I add the TV service files only in so the common file, common YAML only for the test TV service. So I can create multiple files in the test TV service package, but all are using the common YAML, which are common to only TV service and not common to everything. So that also will make my maintainability much more simpler. All right. So I'm going to talk about some of uh, on the framework side. I'm going to talk about uh, the talks file and a little more parameters that I've added. Add options again, as I guess I've already told before. It's TV short is that I get message displayed in a short format and not in a verbose format. And I'm not doing any default PyTest logging. I'm JUnit family. I'm selecting as XUnit1, and then JSON strict is currently off for me. And then this is the global config file that I'm using for it, right? There are multiple other ways to add these, but this is this is one simple way to manage everything in one file, right? Uh, so the next thing I'm going to talk about
Oh,
is,
one more
yeah,
question.
sure.
So you passed the status code and other parameters. Is that also in a YAML file, or is it notepad, just a text file, or what is that?
Which
Uh,
one?
the parameters where
Oh,
the
this one?
You mentioned that status code is this one, and you passed that
Oh,
parameter in the
so
test,
so
right?
so that's a YAML file as well.
That's oh, it's also a YAML file.
Yep.
Okay, okay, okay. And how are you linking that to that test? How are you
Correct.
linking this?
So this is how I'm linking. I'm doing an include. I'm
Okay,
including
okay, okay.
common.yaml, right? So
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
this is the internal link that I'm providing from the test,
Okay.
which will be common to the test folder, right? Now I
Okay.
have another file, global config. This is another file that I want all the tests to use, right? Now
Okay.
this one I'm providing it in my Tavern global config uh, configuration, which I'm
In
providing
the
the name here in the talks file.
okay, in the INI file you're saying,
Right.
right?
So any
Okay.
file that you want to give the access to all the folders to everything that is in your project,
Uh-huh.
you provide here, right? So when I do
Okay.
Tevrin strict off, it's off for everything. I can do an on inside this file as well, but then I made it off for everything that I'm executing. So this basically is applicable to everything that you are doing, right? And this
Okay.
is very specific to this test that I'm running,
Okay. Okay. I get that. Okay.
right? Now,
Yeah. Thank you.
what I'm gonna talk about three test scenarios. One, let's say I'm going to this API TV shows maze, and then I'm using an external head for headers. I'm using an external function called library headers. So I've added headers here. It's nothing but content type, uh, providing this application.json, and I'm gonna do a return content type here. So I'm going to get this header. I don't have to write this line again and again. I can just provide an external function there. And if any changes to content type happens, I can provide it here, right? And then on the second part, once I'm getting the response, I'm checking the status code. It can either be 200 or 404. I'm making it a success in both the cases. And then I get the response and verify response with, and I'm doing the print of that response. And in the JSON, I'm getting the name girls, validating the name that 139 show is basically with the name girls. And then I'm saving the show name, the name of this to a variable called show name, right? In the next test, in the next stage, what I'm doing is I am using the same variable to fetch other details about this show, right? So I'm hitting this URL where I'm providing a variable, which is the same variable as show name in a string format to this URL, and I'm getting the information about that show. And then I'm doing again validating, uh, verifying it with the print, and then I'm validating that the ID is still 139, right? In the third test scenario, what I'm doing is I am I have an external JSON file called sam.json, where I have an email, and email confirmation is true, and here's my email. I don't want to write all the JSON on this file. What I'm doing is I'm including in the JSON method request, I'm including sam.json file, right? So it will create a body for me. And this is one important part of framework. You can create multiple JSON files based on request, and it will make your life much more easier rather than including them in the file itself, right? In the test itself. Well, the reason is that let's say you are having this sam.json content in 10 test, right? Let's assume my email changes for some reason, or you want that person left and you want to change that email address. You have to go to 10 places or 10 files or 5 files, wherever your 10 occurrences are, and you have to change it in all the places that you actually defined that email address, right? And that is really difficult from the maintenance perspective. So in the framework portion, we really need to consider that part. Once you have that, you can use this file for including in the request as well as doing a response validation. So let's assume you have 1,000 lines of codes to validate, 1,000 lines of JSON to validate. You can create a file on the JSON and do similarly. You can validate those responses. So you can do verify response with, and then you can just include JSON and include this .json. You add this line below the verify response with, and it will validate your response with that particular JSON file. And this is another important part where you are data driving your test. So you're doing a parameterize where the key is ID. So I'm using this again, the uh, same link, the same URL that I was using here, where I was hard coding it to 139, but now I'm data driving it using ID with 140 and 141. That's why I was getting a failure here when I looked at this. This is what it is running, right? It is running 140 and 141 ID. So it gives you a detailed description of what kind of data driving you are doing with this test, right? So it will give me more details if I had more details included here. What kind of data I am running. It will add that in the report itself. So it makes my life much more simpler. I will know exactly the failure it happened and with what kind of data made it fail, right? So 140 might be a pass and 141 was a fail, right? Uh, the both are failing because I didn't change my validation. My validation is still with the name girls. But if you look at here, the girl is associated with girls show is associated with ID 139 and not with 140 and 141. So what I was doing was I'm actually intending to make it a failure by hitting the 140 ID and still validating it with girls, just to show you the failure report, right? And let's execute once here and see uh, the execution part. So I did make our concurrent test as 2. So if you look here, it running in 2 threads. If I go here, so this will tell me exactly how many threads my test started with. So this is 1 thread and this is 2nd thread. So it ran 2 tests in parallel, right? If I do uh, if I add the number 4 here, it will run all the 4 tests in parallel and my execution will be really quick. So it should open 4 threads. So if you look here, it opened 4 threads and it executed really fast. So if you look here, it 4 tests passed in 2.80 seconds. If I go on top, it passed in 2.38 seconds. So not a big gain because it was not a big test, but still a good gain, right? So this is how the execution will look like. This is format variable, my reporting in the standard error, ID 141. This is what I was sending. Uh, and this is what I'm getting. So those kind of things. And then if I refresh the report, it should change to the execution time. So it ran on 15 July at 7:56:41, and then again the same failures, and so this time 3 failed. Make sure we have failed because of a key mismatch. Yeah, so the mismatches I was expecting not found, but then the response are too many requests because we are hitting. So this is one of the challenges with running in parallel if your API cannot handle. Because I'm putting too much load on the API. There is internal load balancer that is included in this API request. So if so that it can contain any kind of DDoS attacks, right? So if I'm running too many requests at a single given time, it will give me a status of 429. Uh, and then it won't. So if you look here, the status code is 429 and not 200 or 404. The reason being that we are sending too many requests. So the message that the developer is sending us is too many requests. Please take it easy, right? So that's one kind of limitation in running parallel test. Again, it depends on what kind of implementation your developer team is doing.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's pretty much it on the frame from the framework perspective. Any other question that you guys really want to ask on the framework side? Right.
I have a question. It's Navina. I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, but why are we defining JUnit in PyTest configuration?
Right. So the idea of defining JUnit and PyTest configuration is to get this XML file. So what this XML file is throwing me is giving me a JUnit XML format. So when you look at the any CI/CD tool pipeline, right? They can either they have the plugins for JUnit result parser, right? So they so how CI/CD tools work are they have a developer going into it and doing some plugin which will parse the results. It can either be a JSON parser or XML parser. The XML parser is you need when you're creating a parser, you need to define what kind of format that XML has, right? What kind of XSD that XML has, and that is being defined by JUnit, right? So when I am creating this XML, I'm not creating any normal XML. I'm creating a JUnit formatted XML, right? And now when it goes into when any CI/CD tool tries to read it, it will read based on the plugin JUnit XML parser, right?
Okay, so that is basically the only reason why we are
Correct.
using JUnit. Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
You don't need to use this if your CI/CD can read JSON format, but then you have to customize your reading code in the CI/CD to say that this is what I want out of this JSON, right? This is how you should display that result to me. Because let's assume I'm doing the JSON, it comes in a tree structure, right? Uh, and then I drill down, I keep looking at the text, but it doesn't display a dashboard. So when you want to try to create a dashboard, you pick up an elements from JSON, parse it into in a linear format, right? In a table format, and then you display it based on the aggregation that you can do on JSON. So that code, it can, a lot of people have created uh, those JSON readers, but then if it is very specific to some of, for PyTest, you can easily find it in the marketplace, but then for any other JSON format result, you have to create your own custom code. So it gives us the flexibility to basically plug in without being in the hassle for creating that kind of custom code. So you can either plug in XML if that works for you. You can plug in JSON if it works for you. If you need HTML report, you can have that and store it in your asset folder or artifact folder. If you don't need any of these, you can just remove these library and this from the command line, and you won't get that file. Any other questions?
Hi Sumit, I have a question.
Sure.
Usually an API, like when there is a success response, the code is 200 or 204. So I have like two questions, like why we had to mention that parameter success status code, where usually there are no much variations in the success code, or maybe I am not aware of. At the same time, I also have another question that there can be different error codes, different error scenarios, like how we got 429.
Mhm.
There could be 422 or any 401. So
Mm.
in that case, like there is also a better way to handle it in a common cases, like where we can refer it commonly into different YAML files.
Right. So there are two ways of looking at a status code. So when you look at 429, right, is the response from the server, right? So all the status code that you're looking at is the response from the server. It's not the developer response. It's the response from the server, right? So what 429 means is too many requests, right? And then you have a response from a developer, which is separate from response from the server, where he says, take it easy, right? The reason is
Mhm.
429, 404, and 200, right? If it is and 500 is basically internal server error, right? So if your server is down, it will throw an error code of 500. So the necessity of having a status code at the server level is you exactly know if the issue is with the server or with the API, right? So you try to segregate your issues in two ways. The first one is at the server level, where a lot of time, if your server is up and running, it won't have those many issues. But when, let's say, this 429 error was one example, which is rare because we are hitting four requests in less than a second, right? Because all four hit concurrently, right? Now,
Yeah.
those four requests, that was a unusual. If you hadn't had put a validation of status code, you wouldn't have known that it is because of this reason, right? Because you were not validating the status code. You still had a failed case, but then you wouldn't have known, and you would have to go back and do the same process again to know why exactly it failed, right? Now that's at the server level. At what most developers do is they still have an implementation at the developer level of error codes, which is separate from the server codes, right? The reason is, I'll tell you why. Now, when you send a post request, let's say uh, in this example, uh, I sent a post request with this JSON body, right? Which is sumit.mahajan at testropper.com. I just put sumit.mahajan and remove at the rate testropper.com. That's not a valid email, right? A server will not detect that, right? A server will say that it's still a success because it was able to post. So,
Mm-hmm.
right, it was able to post, but then internally developer did a validation, put in a validation where it says that an email address should contain at the rate. And in the internal error code, he will throw as bad data, right? He can link it with the server response. So I can, if you look at the Flask, I'm returning a status code of 200, right? I can put in that error and still return a response of 200 saying that please correct your data. The data is bad, right? Or I can do an implementation saying asking the server to return a status code of 400 and then tell him that at the server level that it is a bad data and this we cannot do, right? So it depends on implementation to implementation, but generally there are two kind of implementation, one at the server level and one at the developer level. So when you get the 200 response back, but then you go here and you validate that you should be having the name girls, it will fail here because this is internal validation. This is not server validation,
Mm.
right? Because you will have an error message and it won't match with this and it will throw an error. The test will still fail. Even though the status code was 200, but internally your data was bad, and it throw an error code of generally most of the developers will throw in an error code if there is an error, so that they because when they want to debug or a user comes back saying I'm not getting this, then the developer will ask what's the error code that you're getting internally, right? And then he might be able to tell what exactly wrong with it without even going into the code.
Okay, so does this mean that if like your project have a developer defined error codes, then in that case we can still have a common reference and
Correct.
mention that, right?
Correct.
Uh,
Correct.
But at the same time, I was wondering why we had a need to mention a common parameter like success status code for 200, because if there were like a different types of success codes to consider, then mentioning that, I'm just confused for that part. Like why we need to mention that over hard
No,
code.
it's only for better readability,
Okay, got
right?
it.
It's only for better readability, nothing else, right? It's basically if a layman is coming to read your test, he might not know what 200 is, right?
Okay, got
He
it.
might
Okay,
not know what 404 is, what 501 means, right? What 500 means. So from that readability perspective is only the reason. But for the internal error code, the mapping in YAML will really make sense to you, because then you will be able to get into the message detail itself and tell if a developer is throwing an error code of, let's say 1200, that means that we are sending something wrong, right?
okay,
So in both ways, it's for easy readability and maintainability. That's all. But you're right. For standard code like this, you might want to skip it. If you all have technical team and they are the only ones working on it, and you don't have to show this YAML to anyone, basically the idea is that you create this YAML in such a readable format that if you show it to a developer, he will be, or to any business BA analyst, or to your project manager, he should be able to read what exactly this test is doing.
okay,
And
makes sense.
with
Thank
what
you.
and to what it will be compared this JSON body response, like to so it will say that this is a bad data. So how it will be validating the data, like regarding uh, related to which file, to this JSON response body. So it should be validating to some other file or some other database in order to make sure that the data is right or wrong.
So there are two ways. It depends on your project, right? You can either create a JSON file where you put in the expected JSON that you really want to see, and validate it against that. There are multiple ways to say, let's say, name. I don't want to check if the name is girls. I just want to know if the name is there. So one is Tavern provides three or four types of validation, right? So first is the JSON body itself, the whole body, right? So you can compare directly that response with the file, JSON file. Second,
Okay.
second, it provides you with a way of schema validation, right? So if you define that schema somewhere, and when you get a response, you just validate the schema and not the data. The third is it will help you pick up certain values from the JSON body and validate that. Even in name, if I say I don't want the girls, I just want to know if the format is string, right? And it will validate that this is returning a string format, right? Similarly, you can use an external function to do custom validation. So you can write and help. So when I look at this verify response with, it contains a response body, right? So when I write a function here, right? Look here, I already have the response with me. Now, what I do with that response is custom validation that I can do. I'm currently dumping that response into a JSON format and printing it, right? But it's up to me what I do with that response. How do I validate that response? There are multiple ways to do response validation. You can write custom function. You can do a whole JSON body response. You can do schema validation, and then uh, you can do specific item validation.
Or we can also validate like to particular system if there is
Correct.
we have any GUI for like example Salesforce or
Correct.
SAP,
Correct.
we can just validate.
Correct. So what you will do in that case is you will get that data from your GUI itself, right? And then you can add that either in a custom function saying, okay, I have this response. Now go to the GUI. Let's assume I'm using integrating it with some other uh, database, and then I'm getting the values from that database. And then I can even use Robot Framework in there. So I actually go into the GUI in a custom function, get the data out of the UI, and then validate each and individual response based on what response I have.
So to get the data out, we have to create the dictionary or something, or the list, or like, is there any
So
particular way?
uh, it again depends on from where you're getting the data. So you have the response body, which is in a JSON format, right? You either pass the JSON yourself, or you whatever data you're getting, you create your JSON yourself. That becomes a bit trickier because that needs a lot of custom code needs to be added. What I recommend is that you pick up one item at a time, right? Let's say you are getting from the UI all the values that you're getting, and just you parse these items uh, in the response JSON format and validate one by one in there, right? Though you are only running your UI test once, you are only picking up the values from UI once, but you're storing it, let's say, in a list or in a dictionary, it doesn't matter. But when you are validating the response, just parse this response that you already have into into the value that you are validating against.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Any other question? I think we are again over time. All right. I
Hi,
guess.
Sumit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just the
Go ahead.
last question.
Sure.
Sorry, I joined late. So I was also exploring another framework called Karate DSL. So
Yes,
will you be covering that one also in the future,
that's
or?
correct. That's correct. So we are going to cover Karate DSL in our next API session. That will be on Karate.
Okay, then. Thank you.
So we
Hey,
had
Sumit.
this. Yeah.
I mean, I think we should stop, Sumit, because it's 16-minute over. Maybe we need
Right.
to.
Sure. 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 Yeah. 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 I was about to close only.
Yeah.
So y-
So if there are questions and stuff like that, people, you should encourage the people to collaborate in the MS Teams, right? Not only
right.
during the sessions,
Th-
online and offline, right?
That.
So whatever the
Yeah.
questions that you can take within this, you can take,
Sure.
and outside of it, you just ask them to type it in the Teams, and you will respond them after the session, right? It's a
Sure.
17 minutes over.
Yeah.
Over.
All right. So that's it for today's session. Any questions that you guys have, you can just put it in the Teams, and I will get back to you
Yep.
uh, on that. All right. Thank you so
Perfect.
much, guys.
All right, guys, the hackathon channel, look it up and join if you're interested. With that, sorry, we tend to keep the punctuality of the time, no offense. And also we wanted to encourage you to, really connect with us after and before the session, not only during the session. That is one of the success factor for us in helping you guys, right? So apologies to cut this off, but we will have to ensure that we are keeping on time, 1 hour per week, and all the questions and answers has to be asked and discussed and shared in the Microsoft Teams. And if you do not have access to the Microsoft Teams, send email to programs@testoper.com. Programs at testoper.com. With that, I'll see you guys next Wednesday. And for those who are attending IA track on Saturday, I'll see you guys on Saturday. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.